Hi everyone, I'm back today with another Hercule Poirot Agatha Christie review, which is probably the one thing you can always count on eventually on this channel. And we have now arrived at Cat Among the Pigeons. As soon as I read the paragraph synopsis for this book, I already suspected it was going to be a dud. Revolution in the Middle East, a princess attending a girls' boarding school, a packet of jewels. Yes, this novel had all the makings of a real clunker. So you can imagine my surprise when, after the first hour or so of introductory material, I actually found myself hooked in spite of these aforementioned factors that I often really dislike in Poirot novels. And you can further imagine how surprised I was when halfway or more through the book, despite, or maybe because of, the rather unconventional scenario and exposition of this novel, I was still thoroughly enjoying myself. Cat Among the Pigeons is not an ordinary Poirot novel. First and foremost because Poirot makes an extremely late appearance, but also because it strays quite far from Christie's most archetypal mystery formula, and because of that, it actually felt fresh and original to me despite being so far along in the Poirot collection. Granted, it's not necessarily the best as a puzzle mystery, for reasons I'll discuss later, so depending on the reader's moods and interests, I don't imagine this will be a favorite for everyone. Yet in this novel, Christie manages to telegraph very early on just what this novel will and won't be, in a way that I think truly gets the reader excited for what is to come, instead of creating one kind of expectation and then completely undermining it by doing something else by the end of the book. Because of this, she even manages to pull off several tropes that she's tried in the past to much less success, in my opinion. In fact, as a blend of mystery and thriller, with these sort of especially implausible elements Christie sometimes dabbles in, I found this novel actually about as good as it gets. It brings in the best of both styles while discarding some of the worst pitfalls that each of those types, mystery and thriller, sometimes falls into. At its worst, the puzzle-type mystery can feel like an exercise for the sake of an exercise without much real life or character to it. Not that most of Christie's mysteries are like that, but occasionally we do see one of that sort. And at its worst, the thriller-type mystery can just feel like a bunch of exceedingly unlikely occurrences that start to undermine any real sense of suspense. I started to feel this a bit during the second half of The Man in the Brown Suit, despite somewhat liking that novel overall. This novel, Cat Among the Pigeons, does not fall into those traps, and because of this, we get some interesting and implausible twists and turns, all while still having elements of a real mystery to figure out. Now, this is a Poirot novel, supposedly, but by the time I started collecting some thoughts for this review, I was about 2/3 of the way into the novel, and Poirot had still not yet even been mentioned. It's sort of akin to the appearance of Miss Marple most of the way through The Moving Finger. Of course, I don't think the novel really suffers for it. It may have been even better in some ways, but it's not really a Poirot novel. Poirot is more of a guest character in this novel than the character of the novel. For me, the girls' school setting was new and fun. I thought at first it might end up being similar to Hickory Dickory Dock, with a lot of young kids coming together and kind of being portrayed in a goofy, way that old people see young people sort of manner, but it's really not. It's quite different, and maybe part of that is that these students are more of your actual kids, not university-aged young adults. Also because the main attention in this novel is, I'd say, more on the teachers, the adults of the school. There are a few students of interest, including Jennifer Sutcliffe and her clever friend Julia Upjohn, our pseudo-protagonists, as well as our foreign princesses attending the school, although actually one of those princesses seems to never be mentioned again after an offhand mention at the start. But the narrative is not as centered on these young folks as it is in Hickory Dickory Dock, and most of them are not really suspects. Even the title was, I thought, fairly clever, creating some suspense, not quite invoking one of these classic Christie nursery rhymes with everything that has to live up to or live down to as it usually is, and relevant in more ways than one, describing people who are not who they seem or something hidden in a seemingly ordinary place. That's not a spoiler because it's pretty obvious right from the start that you're going to be seeing these elements. And I thought this title worked in a way that, unlike some of the other nursery rhyme titles, wasn't forced for me. So all in all, a pretty good read, especially if you're in the mood for this sort of thing. Now, I'm already going to get into the spoilers though now, so be warned if you're still going to read this one. So one immediate and persistent point of attention was this tennis racket. This is actually pretty funny because the first time the tennis racket was mentioned, I thought, that was a pretty transparent way of drawing our attention to that. And then after a few more mentions, I'm sure I could count at least 5 non-subtle references by the middle of the book, including one where a character literally says, "What could they have wanted to steal? Our tennis rackets?" By this point, I figured we have to assume that this is real and not just a red herring, which would be super annoying and clumsy if it were a red herring brought up that many times. And that probably the jewels are somehow concealed in these tennis rackets, as they are. And that Agatha Christie wants us to know this because she's not being sneaky about it or even playing it off as a possible red herring at this point. She's just upfront with it. Anyway, this tennis racket shenanigans is not only amusing, Christie obviously sees it as important that we readers think the jewels are in the rackets, which is why she keeps reminding us of this. The central mystery is not exactly where the jewels are or how they've been concealed, although there is a bit of ambiguity about this after this sort of shell game of where the girls keep switching their rackets around. The mystery is more, though, about what's going on, who all these characters are, and so forth. And part of the fun of this novel is this sense that we constantly know quite a bit more about what's going on than the characters at large and than the police. I mean, certainly some of the characters have their secrets, but we're much more certain that these jewels are involved somehow, that they have to do with Ali Yusuf's death, if he in fact died at all. And we even know before the detectives that a certain character is a spy, that another is the daughter of the woman who unknowingly received the jewels before the term began, and so on. Even the part about the tennis rackets, while on one hand you might have felt annoyed when this keeps coming up again and again and the characters still have no clue what's going on, you might just as likely feel like I did some strange joy in knowing something they don't, even though it's not really due to my own cleverness. There are even a few elements of this novel that I normally kind of dislike, but that worked here much better for me than usual. First of all, we have characters who are not who they seem to be. It often just kind of annoys me when late in the novel, some very important character turns out to be some other imposter who was mentioned casually in the very beginning of the novel, like some person who showed up in a news report in the first chapter. This just isn't something that I usually find very satisfying. However, in this novel, Christie sets it up right from the beginning to basically say, trust no one, because people aren't who you think they are. So I was absolutely fine with this here, particularly because for most of these characters, we're not privy to enough of their thoughts that we should really be all that surprised if they turn out to be someone totally different. The involvement with larger political or global intrigue is also something that I think works poorly when sandwiched into a more conventional mystery, like in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, a novel that seems at first to be a more contained murder at the dentist, but then spirals into a wild goose chase involving communist agitators, fascist-leaning gardeners, and a big fat hen. But here, that stuff isn't used in a misleading way, nor does it emerge midway through the story as some sort of wild and unwanted twist. No, here we learn the story of the jewels and the revolution in the fictional kingdom of Ramat very early on, in a way that I think works really well and, to my astonishment, actually got me interested in spite of my initial skepticism. As for the mystery itself, is it even solvable or is it just too complicated? Well, I didn't solve it, which makes it hard for me to tell whether I just missed some important clues or if it was not really meant to be solvable. I figured the kidnapping of Princess Shaista, who turns out to be an imposter, was something she set up as a sort of hoax to get the money once this actually happened. This wasn't quite correct, but I think there's plenty of reason for readers to guess something's amiss with a princess from the start. Also, her presence here seems like it would have to be either an unreasonable coincidence or somehow relevant to the simultaneous presence of the jewels, which in a normal puzzle mystery would feel like a clue, and it is kind of a clue here, although in this context, you might reasonably have doubts as to whether it's not simply a coincidence, just because in the thriller type novels, we often see Christie playing fast and loose with what is really probable. Though I'm not sure, when I think about it, if there actually are any super egregious coincidences in this novel, despite the backstory being rather grandiose. And there are lots of characters as suspects, which always makes it hard for readers to determine which ones to pay attention to, and thus is often something that I don't love so much. For example, in Five Little Pigs, I pointed out that that's kind of the opposite case where I think the mystery works really well because it's so well contained. But in this novel, Christie drops hints throughout of who's fair game and directs our attention to the more primary suspects. For example, is Adam Goodman a double-crosser? Could the more random servants be involved? Probably not by the time we're partway through the book. Now, the primary killer, the secretary Anne Shapland, does definitely escape our attention enough to be a bit of a surprise if you're not expecting her by the end. Although I think if you were reading carefully, you probably could see some meta-level clues that she might be the one coming out guilty. But she certainly remains in the story enough that she's definitely fair game as a suspect. So all in all, an enjoyable read for me. I wouldn't go as far as to call it a solid Poirot novel, because it's not really much like your typical Poirot novel. But if you consider it for what it was, I'd easily place it in the top half of the Poirot series in terms of my overall enjoyment. But is there enough to figure out who the killer is without guessing? Well, let me know if you figured it out and how you knew it. And maybe leave a spoiler tag just in case someone else reads it who hasn't read the book yet. And there's more Poirot coming up soon, as I've already actually myself read The Clocks, third girl, and I'm currently working on Halloween Party. See you next time, and happy reading.